Hi, I'm Jennifer Woosley Saylor. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor and the kid of a cop. And this is the podcast When the Call Hits Home.
Hey everyone, it's Ashlee Gethner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I'm also a child of a police officer.
Welcome back. Ashlee, I'm
Thank
so glad it's
you.
me and you again.
I know. But let me tell you,
Oh,
you were
okay.
fabulous.
Oh.
I loved your
I
episode.
never want to do it without you ever again.
Stuff. It was so good. I can't help but ask you right now, like, how did that feel?
Well, I mean, it just felt like a normal day because it's just talking to somebody I know pretty well. I've gotten some feedback that we have some great detectives in our audience because everybody's been like, I know who that was. Um, I also got some feedback that I may or may not have spoken over our last guest. And I laughed a little bit and I sent that to him. And he's like, typical big sister. And I'm like, yeah, typical big sister. I'm in charge and listen to what I have to say to do. I
Oh,
think big sisters get a rap for being bossy. I don't know if you have any experience.
you know what's funny is that I actually really loved that because I felt like you got like the dynamic was there, which I love because I'm the baby of the family. So I have
Right.
two older sisters, and I know that the cool thing about this is that one day I'll record with them and everyone will get to hear it. But I'm pretty sure the same dynamic will come out. However, I feel like as the baby, I'm the bossy one.
Oh, are you?
I'm a little more assertive, I think. Like I'm a little more, yeah, just kind of call us like a spade a spade.
Yeah. Well, it's another great thing I love about you.
Oh,
But
jeez, thank
yeah,
you.
I
But
definitely can be
that's what
bossy,
I loved
bigger
it for
sister.
you guys. Like, I thought that was great. That's so funny you say that, though.
It's true. It's
Well, it
true.
was a fantastic episode.
Oh, well, thank
So
you.
you guys should be
But I've
really
missed
proud.
you, and I'm glad that we're back at it
I
today.
do have to share with our listeners that I'm coming off of a Bears loss. This is a big deal. This is
I
a
know.
big deal. I'm on here
Well, the
recording.
fact that you showed up, or actually would talk to anybody after a Bears loss is difficult.
I gotta
Thoughts and
know.
prayers. Thoughts and prayers.
Or when the call hits home family has to know this is how much I care because I'm on here and you know what it feeds into some of these things we talk about. So first off, everyone knows that I'm identical to my dad in a lot of ways, and this is one way.
Hmm.
But two, I couldn't help but think so my dad's in Washington for the game, and immediately my brain was like, well, I hope he regulates his emotions right now because
Yeah,
that can end not so good when you're in an away team stadium. He
right.
did. He's fine. He's good. But I sure as heck struggled with it after that game. So I was like, wow, talk about learning how to regulate emotions after football games feeds right into the things we talk about on this podcast. But I had to share that because it's important for everyone to know. This is where my priority lies, you know?
Well, it is because I did message you and say, will this help or hurt if
Jennifer
we
said, so I'm kind of scared. Don't know what we should do here. No, I'm just kidding. I loved it. But I think we have a great. So, one of the things that we have been really working, I mean, first off, we've been working hard. So,
we
I'm
have.
super proud of us. I think that our listeners are going to be so surprised of what's to come.
I'm super excited. Like I was speaking to a friend and I was just like, I can't believe the things that are kind of happening behind the scenes right now. So absolutely.
Yeah, like it's about to keep getting bigger and bigger, and I'm just so excited for everyone involved, and I hope more people keep coming on and keep,
Yes.
participating and kind of getting these resources that are about to be their way. So I'm pumped about it. And I
Yeah.
think today, even one of the things that we love to do is we love to talk to each other about, what are some topics, what are some things that in our childhood or even like clinical wise are
Hmm.
we running across, and something that's been kind of weighing heavy on me lately and just kind of encompasses everything. So it happened as a kid. I remember it as being a child of a first responder, and now just going through everything that you and I work through. Is this piece of like organizational dysfunction or organizational trauma, whichever way you want to put it, right? Frustration within departments.
So can we define like what organizational trauma is or what that looks like for people maybe who aren't familiar or is familiar with that term, like what that means?
So for me, like when I think about that, and please, actually, you're really, really good at definitions compared to me, but
Let me Google real quick. Hold on.
right. I'm like, so this is great because I don't know the real one off the top of my head. But for me, it looks like my organizational dysfunction, right, is this struggle within departments or within wherever you work, honestly, career-wise. This could be for someone who's not even a first responder, even listening, right? So within your own work, kind of having that dysfunction, maybe more of a negative feel towards others or having things happen to you that's negative. My brain can't help, and I can't go into it right now because that would be a whole nother episode. But thinking about just like that moral injury, that type of things that happen to us at our workplace that really don't mesh well.
Right.
So give us a nice breakdown of that if you want, Jennifer, because clearly my brain's not there.
Well, just, some things that show up when you Google, really top-notch research here. But it's an emotional response to a negative events at work. I mean, that's a pretty simple thing. But I think we're talking really about experiences within the, I'm going to keep using the word organizational. That's not good for a definition, but within the system of place.
There it
So,
is.
when we're talking first responder stuff, we're definitely talking pieces about the firehouse, about, if you're in a small city, even the city dynamics from which you're working in.
Geez.
Obviously, thinking from a dispatcher perspective, the call room. And then obviously, you and I a little bit in terms of the organization within a police department.
Well, I'm so thankful you just said systems because that's really what it falls back on a lot of the time, I feel. And there's so many systems that are at play here.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it be the individual, the department itself, and then my brain can't help but to think about also some of these departments, if we're talking about like sheriff's departments, right? We're going even bigger scheme too. It's like the political atmosphere of things.
Oh, absolutely.
So there's so many systems that are intertwined, which make this topic, I think, extremely hard.
It is. And one thing, I mean, I don't know, the word trauma might be slightly overused in our lexicon. But what I will always say with people, because, when I meet with clients, we're not always comfortable using the word trauma. And so it's just really something outside of our control, like something that we don't have control over, be it a situation, be it how an organization is run, like all those kind of things. Okay, I think I had us down a rabbit hole about the definition, but that's kind of what we're talking
that's
about.
Important, right? Like if whoever's listening to this, we want them to know that this is what we're talking about. It's a pretty heavy topic. And so that's why it's something that I felt like needed to be talked about, because there's me. Everything in my life has been like, ooh, there's the fire walking at Ash. But I think it is super important to talk about because it really struck a chord with me this past week of thinking back to my childhood. And I feel like I did see this happen firsthand. Now, one thing I want every first responder to remember is that your children are always listening.
Always.
And we hear everything. And I remember often hearing about some of the things happening like within my dad's department and being kind of like, just like kind of sad or disappointed sometimes of like, oh, well, that's weird. Why would that? Because of course we put our first responders at such a high standard in life. And to hear those things happening within departments were really sad. And I saw, and I hope, I think he's okay with me saying this, but I did see early on in my life, I remember my dad, like first off, he always loved being a police officer. That's something he was very good at. And it's something that he's very proud of. And he still is.
Yeah. I love what he said on his episode about getting in the wrong line.
Did he not just, I'm like, oh, here we are. You know what, Dad, let it out. No. So he did love it and he was very good at it. And I think it was a great career for him. I just do remember him towards the end of retirement being ready to retire. And I don't think it had much to do with the actual job. I do think it had to do with the department frustration, the lack of support, and just feeling like he was having to maybe do things or be a certain way in which he never had to be before. And he didn't want to be that person. And I felt, looking at it now, I'm like, oh my gosh, well, that's such a hard internal conflict.
Right.
And let me tell you one thing that is something I'm so extremely proud about with my dad is
Aw.
that my dad, his biggest thing when he was a police officer was serving his community. That was his favorite thing. He would
Mm.
go above and beyond. I promise you, this man would give everything to anyone in his community. And so when he actually started to, have some kickback on some of
Mhm.
the positive things he would do.
Mm.
And when that started to happen is when he started to really be like, whoa, this is not what I signed up
Mm.
for. That was through my eyes. That was through
Well,
my eyes.
and so I guess, can we talk a little bit about that impact for you in terms of like through your eyes?
Yeah, I think for me, I definitely remember just being confused and kind of
Mm.
sad because we talk about these departments being such a family place.
Right.
But then when you hear about stuff like that happening, you have to have this realization that it's maybe not what you think. And that's hard, right? Like,
That is, I mean, that's a grief. There's a
yeah,
loss there of what my expectation was, what I thought this was going to be, what I'm doing, and
yeah,
that changing. That's hard.
yeah, for
And
sure.
I can't imagine. I mean, I don't know your dad like, you know him. I feel very fortunate that I've gotten to meet him before, but I can't imagine him not just being him, you know,
Right.
asking somebody to not be themselves. Like that's
Yeah. Yeah, for
extremely
sure.
hard.
And look at
Mhm.
me like sharing his information. Dad, don't you can well, you can't really ground me anymore. I'm pretty old. Um, but well, actually, go ahead. If that means like, okay, I'll stay home and not, no, just
Right.
kidding. There's just like a memory that comes to mind for me, and I think it's a really good example of what this started to look like for him that I just remember him being upset about, coming home upset about it. And this is the thing that I think is important and I want people to realize is that organizational frustration, and I know we're going to have episodes down the line where we really get into this, and so
Yes, we are.
I'm pretty
People
pumped
keep
about it.
listening.
Like, yes, I want people to think of this episode as kind of like the creaking the door open, but we're about to
Right.
bust this door down in some of these later episodes.
Right.
But one of these examples that I'm talking about here is I remember him coming home and he was really sad and like just upset. And I was like, Dad, like, what is going on? I was a little older at this time and it was near the end of his career. And he had told me like he was really frustrated because he had helped an elderly woman, I
Mm.
think she was like in her 80s. She was homeless. And so
No.
he helped her and he got her food, he got her lunch, and then he brought her to a shelter. I mean, he bought her lunch with his own money.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like he just wanted to take care of her. He brought her to a shelter. The shelter, for some reason, I don't know what it was, but they like called the department being like, and maybe her age or something that they felt they couldn't care for her. But long story short, there, he ended up getting written up.
Stop.
We're literally getting this woman food for like helping her. And that's that right? Like, what do you mean?
Oh
Like,
my goodness.
why would, because he did some, like,
Right.
that doesn't make sense. But like to my dad, he would never stop being that person,
Right.
or should he? Right.
Right.
But that's what I'm talking about here is like things like that. And once those write ups, man, oof, once those
Hmm.
write ups and stuff start coming, when you're following your own ethics, your own values, your own morals, you're just being a human, like that really
Right.
destroys them.
Yeah.
So it started to mount in that way.
Mhm.
And then I feel like, again, this is my interpretation, these officers, when things like that start to happen and you start to question your department and their loyalty to you, like that's your brotherhood, that's your sisterhood, that's
Mhm.
something you feel so connected to. And I can't help but recognize, like, yeah, my dad came home upset and I was old enough and he did a good job to communicate with me on that of what was going on. But
Right.
if it really gets bad, these things, I think it impacts families at home. And that's why it's so important for us to talk about because,
Right.
yes, it does come home with that officer.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's wild. I'm having an emotional response, and this is how many years later,
Right.
like that
Right.
is just heartbreaking and so disappointing. And it makes sense on why we see so many things like this happening when that's just, a small experience of this.
Exactly. And I think
Hmm.
too, I look at these situations now, both you and I are blessed to work either with law enforcement or fire or what have you, or just know them because of our
Hmm.
what we do now, like
Hmm.
trainings and in the podcasts and stuff. We know so many people that open up to us about these things. And I've heard stories, I've listened, definitely listened to how the organizational frustration has caused people to like stop sleeping, stop eating, to be, yes, right, to be so anxious. And so what happens is they go home and they're trying, our kids and your spouses, they don't necessarily know how to respond to it.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I feel like I have a little bit lighter. I don't know if lighter. It's still kind of a crappy situation, but just how things work. And when I was younger, my dad was taking the lieutenant's test and had planned to be a lieutenant, and they had, I'm making this number up, 10 slots. And that was the plan. My dad made it underneath that 10 kind of umbrella. And then all of a sudden it changed. And it's like, well, actually, we're only accepting 5, because of things that happen within a city system, what they have the budget for, who knows why. But it's
Exactly.
that, that silly game I make people play when they come to my class. And who doesn't love a game that you're playing and the rules change all of a sudden,
Mhm.
And I think sometimes that's extremely hard to navigate that as well. And again, it's those things that are outside of our control are the ones that kind of keep us up at night sometimes. Like, I can't create another lieutenant's position. Like, that's not in my scope. And what's so interesting about this, my poor mother, like, she was so upset about that. Like, she was the one that I
Oh,
think we got more of like a response for. Obviously, some disappointment for her spouse and her partner, probably some disappointment in terms of like, oh, I imagine a lieutenant makes a little bit more, and just things like that. And we were talking about that, Ashlee, in our meeting we had about, you get a promotion and now you're the bottom man on the totem pole. And, like, oh, I used to work days, but now I'm the new guy here. And so I'm working nights. Those are all system things that are really hard to navigate. And I don't know, it's difficult. I don't know if this is the place to share this metaphor, but I think it's helpful. And I talk to a lot of people who have job frustration sometimes about the metaphor, because it was shared to me. Because again, like what we're talking about is not just a first responder issue, it's anybody that has
yeah,
a job issue.
right.
But somebody told me this once, and I think it's so true, because I was getting so frustrated at this job, and like I'm, trying to get this work done or trying to make this progress, and I'm doing all this stuff and you're not seeing any change. And they told me, wow, you can go 90 miles an hour. Like, you have the ability to go 90 miles an hour. Unfortunately, you're at a car that tops out at 30. And I think sometimes that is helpful within those like systems to recognize like where your abilities are, like
Yeah.
coming back to that interpersonal piece of like, oh, this is my skill, this is what I'm good at. And then exploring, now listen, Ashlee, you're the systems expert here, but
Ugh,
looking at this system and kind of recognizing, and I know that there's systems that can go 90 miles an hour. I'm not trying to
right,
be Debbie
right.
Downer, but I think sometimes it's helpful. I don't know, that metaphor was helpful for me.
You know what? I love that. I do really love that because I think it makes a lot of sense. And honestly, like that whole everything you just said, my brain has caught on to a few points. And I don't mean to bring us back, but I think what there was a few things in what you said that are super important to identify. One is that so much of it is out of our control.
Right.
And the other part is, you're right. When we were having those meetings and kind of talking about the impacts of these first responder jobs on our families,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So one, I think, and your mom being so sweet because she was so, you know what I mean, upset.
Right.
I think
Oh,
that's
she
fair.
was not sweet. She was very angry, but
Well,
that
I
was
was trying to, I was trying to give her a little,
I'm teasing.
and she had the right to be though, because guess
Right.
what? It's our spouses, it's our significant others at home who see us working hard, right? So see their
Mm-hmm.
first responder loved one working their butts off to be who they want to be. And
Right.
so I think it's very hard in these jobs not to assume sometimes too that like favorites and political stuff are at play when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
that. And I don't know, I'm not saying every situation, but I do think definitely some that can happen.
Yeah.
But then you're right. If we do get that promotion, life drastically shifts for us again. And if you have kids, right, like they are
Right.
having to go through that too. You saying that just made me think of a friend that I have who her husband is a police officer, and did get promoted and then had to go to third shift. Well, her kids are smaller, but they won't sleep. They've been having so much
Oh,
trouble sleeping because they're worried about their dad being at work and
oh,
they're not used to him not being home like that.
right.
And it's been tough on them, right? So
Of course.
we can't miss out on this fact of like those all of that within the organization truly does come home to the family.
Yeah.
And one thing that I had talked about before too is this notion of when we are stressed with the department stuff, we come home, we use our significant other as an outlet, which is
Mhm.
great because hey, in this situation we're communicating and we know that that could be tough for our first responders. But then what do we do when there's no change happening?
Exactly.
Right? So then our significant other is stuck with this frustration of supporting their spouse, which may lead to anger at the department or within the department because of
Mhm.
whatever's happening.
Right.
But then after so long, when there's no change, that could lead to dysfunction within the marriage or what have you, because what else can they do to help? I hear that all the time.
That is definitely a hard one. And unfortunately, I don't know, unfortunately, but this is what I've seen and heard, a first responder feeling like I chose this career in terms of it's a
Mm-hmm.
calling. And again, like you said, coming and communicating with the spouse, positive, but sometimes the spouse being like, well, let's look for something different, look for a new job. And
Yes.
back to this kind of identity thing, there's a difference between a job, a calling. There's a difference between a career and a calling. And so you're kind of asking somebody again not to be true to themselves if being a first responder was a calling for them. And so where from a solutions factor, like, well,
Yes.
here's the problem. It's this job. So just don't do that job anymore. Hello, that's the perfect solution. But when you're asking somebody who, again, this is a calling for, you know, sometimes I've worked with people and unfortunately have taken that very personal from their partner when maybe that's not necessarily what their partner meant, or maybe it was. And it's kind of like, well, you don't know me a little
Mm-hmm.
bit.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of to your point about communicating as a first responder, it can be easy to throw up those walls when we're vulnerable about something. And then that's somebody's solution for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And look, like I obviously with this, it's just been something that has been weighing on me because I've been thinking about my own childhood experiences with it and then just hearing things around me a lot of the time. I mean, I don't claim to know everything about this. And so I hope that our listeners like this is a big topic. So
If they're listening because they
uh-huh.
think I know anything, we're in trouble. So,
Well, I hope they give us some feedback on it, right? It's
right,
like, I think one of the things that will be really helpful and unite our community here is talking about what that looks like, the
right.
organizational aspect looks like on our families and stuff. I don't think we could sit here and say that it doesn't impact our families in some way. I think sometimes it impacts our family positively. I think
Of
that's a thing.
course.
I don't want to turn my head to that.
Speaking of the positive piece, I want to throw back to, is it Ben? When we interviewed about the EMS games, it was Ben.
Ben and
And
Chris, yep.
what I loved Ben said at the episode is like, let's look at what we do well. And I love that in terms of like thinking about that perspective of a first responder, like what are we really good at?
Yeah.
So I agree. Like it's not like this isn't doom scrolling. Like, there's definitely some things we do good. And honestly, this is just about what our experiences is and like, oh, I know that as a
Yeah.
parent or again, I was a kid of a first responder. Oh, I totally get that. That's what this
Yeah.
is really about. I also just wanted to point out, since I'm doing callbacks to other
Yes. Do
episodes,
it.
but thinking about our episodes with kids of firefighters and talking a lot about a family in the firehouse and
Hmm.
how they function, and oh my goodness, I can't imagine like a family at work because like family is tough, and to think about that. And I really appreciated Eric's episode, and he kind of talked about being at certain houses that maybe wasn't a fit for him, and that's an example
Yeah.
of something in terms of just an organizational, again, I don't want to use the word trauma, but an organizational, what word did you use earlier that I liked?
Dysfunction.
Thank you. Like,
Yeah.
and it wasn't even, I don't even have to say that it was a dysfunction. It was just like, oh, this isn't an
It's a
organizational
conflict
fit.
for sure, right? Like it's just a little
Yes.
conflict that we run into. But I think absolutely fire
Yeah.
side of things, holy moly, you're spending a lot of time with those folks.
Yeah,
And when
exactly.
that system is shaken, I've seen it firsthand, when that system is shaken, man, is it impactful.
Oh, totally. And it can be as simple as like personalities that get along together and personalities that don't get
Oh yeah.
along together, and that's not anybody's fault. That's just humans being humans. So I
Yeah.
just, I don't want to forget our other kids of first responders and thinking about this in applicable ways to fire and dispatch and
Yeah.
EMTs. So
Oh, absolutely. And I think it really does go across the board with everyone, honestly. It happens everywhere. We know that.
mhm.
And that's another important piece about this that I say all the time, especially when I'm working and I'm hearing these things. It's like it's at every department. It
Right.
really is. Sometimes this happens when you just get a group of people together,
Yep.
right? Like that's sociology says. So like that's what happens when we
Mhm.
have groups of people together, but at the same time, it's hard to ignore because I've seen it cause so much distress. I've
Absolutely.
seen it literally break people down, and I'm going to make a really, really, really bold statement. A
Oh,
little
I'm
nervous
sitting
about
down.
it. I
Mhm.
know. I'm actually a little nervous about it. But with my research, with my dissertation,
Mhm.
the organizational part of it was huge,
Of course.
huge
Of
in
course.
how our first responders who were in the front lines of civil unrest did not feel support at all
Mm,
from their own departments.
right.
So that weighs heavy on me from working with first responders and from hearing it so much. I do tend to lean that when we're looking at this is a big one for me, so I'm a little nervous. When we're looking at like suicide numbers for our first
Mm,
responders, I truly think a lot of the times it's the stuff within the walls of their department that gets them more than it is the job. I do think that a lot happens from the job, but when you encompass like when things happen on the job, but then you encompass the stuff that can happen within the walls, I truly think that that breaks somebody sometimes.
Well, I think it's that whole thing too, in concept of to any job, but I think you go and you're trained and you're at the academy and you're doing all these
Mhm.
things and you're totally prepared to how to, respond to a house fire, respond to shooting. But I don't know that there's training about how do you respond to somebody throwing you under the bus
I was just about to
or
say feeling backdoored.
exactly. Like, I don't think that those are things that are happen. And so I think that's the other thing that's extremely hard to your point, like, what am I supposed to do with this? I knew how to respond to this. I know. And I mean, I obviously a very biased opinion. I love that first responders are having more honest conversations about mental health and things like that.
Yeah.
But I still think that there is this piece, which is why this is weighed on you, Ashlee, like, hey, can we please talk about this elephant in the room and the weight that it's having on first responders. So,
Yes. Yeah.
this is why I'm so glad it's me and you, because you're talking
I
about this heavy stuff. Like, it's
and I
important.
feel like that's what we have to do on this podcast. Why we wanted to do it, right? Is like you are so right on that. It is this elephant. It is this like topic that a lot of people don't want to go towards, but we have to. We have to when
Mhm.
it's screaming in our faces that
Right.
there's this problem. And let me promise you something. It eats me alive as a clinician when I have someone sitting in front of me who is so broken over something that I cannot control. Like do you know what I mean? Like when they're broken in front of me and they're feeling all these sorts of ways because of what's happening to them within their department, and I can't. I what I want to do is go like mama mode, even though I'm not
Right.
right, and go calling their bosses and being like, "Hey," but it can't, and I hate
Mhm.
that feeling more than anything. Probably again why I had to bring it up in an episode because how do I help? Right. And
Mhm.
I think what's really cool is that Jennifer and I have been like, yeah, how do we help? So we're
Mhm.
finding the right people that are going to come on here, that are going to
Mhm.
teach us how to help. and teach our listeners how to work through that with their families as well.
Right. Well, and I think, callback first episode, this whole episode is just me full of callbacks. But, I think it is our place of saying, okay, the car tops out at 30. Well, let me figure out how to maybe get new tires on it so it can go a little faster. Like it's all about naming as children of first responders is about figuring out what we can control, what we can make a difference in for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I live by too, and I don't, for children, this would be a little bit harder. I think for spouses, though, this might be a great like tool. And you know it as well as a clinician, but because again, what do you say to them in these situations?
Right.
I think that could be very hard. But I think you have to go, sometimes it's just about listening. I always say,
Mm.
just ask them. Just say, literally ask your significant other, are you wanting me to give you feedback right now, or are you just
Right.
wanting me to listen?
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I know I say this all the time to my clients, so I'll probably say it all the time here, but I definitely think at times like I'm not really doing rocket science in terms of therapy, just listening. And then I'll go out into the world and see all the places where I'm not heard. And so I do think it's an incredible superpower to be able to listen. And we definitely want to be listening to the people we love. And the same, for our kids as well,
Yeah,
and I think when we're
absolutely.
bogged down with, the things happening at work, it takes away from our abilities at times to really hear our kids as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I kind of want to throw in there, I don't, again, right, as a child of a first responder, kind of taking off my clinical hat, I'm actually really grateful looking at the situation
Mm,
that my dad did tell me.
yeah.
And I think that I encourage obviously appropriate to the child's age.
Mm,
But I honestly think that with me and my dad having conversations about this, it opened the door to a big learning experience for me.
right.
It, was a learning experience for him. I appreciated understanding where he was coming from, and it gave me just an ability to, because again, we hear the things.
Hmm.
So like one of the worst things about that is when you hear it and then it can leave your child, like don't get me wrong, like I was angry and
Well,
stuff
of
when I was,
course, you're gonna be upset for your
yeah,
dad being upset.
exactly.
That's a
Yes.
healthy thing that happens. Like that's not a negative thing.
Yes, but I think again with him communicating with me and us having talks about it, it really did help our relationship, and then just help me as a child of a first responder too kind of understand a little bit more about how life isn't always just perfect like that. Like it isn't what it may seem sometimes, and it
Well,
just
and
was
I think
helpful.
a powerful lesson too, in terms of like, it's still about doing what's right.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
I got in trouble, but I still did what was right.
And that's where that pride comes in for me, because I just know that that's who he was,
Hmm.
right? As an officer, and I can't be more proud of him for that.
Wow. Sounds like that's who he is as a man and as a dad as well, but absolutely, of course. And
Yeah.
his,
Yeah. Yeah.
mhm.
That's so true. That's so true. And then, right, like this is right here, and what we're talking about feeds off of our last episode that you and I did together, of just like when stuff was hitting the fan, right? It's like these moments of like, I wish everybody knew that about my dad,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? But they
Right.
don't, because he's wearing a uniform that says he's what he
Right.
is, right?
Right.
Um,
Mhm.
but that's just went full circle for me on this show. Like that, these things here of being so proud of him for that, of, and not every department has its good things, departments have their bad things, but like being that person is something that he should always be proud of. It's something that I know I'm proud of. And it's just those things that I wish everybody saw, is that most officers want to do those things,
Yeah, absolutely.
so it's
Mhm.
man, it's a cycle, it's a system for sure.
It sure is. And I mean, as always, Ashley, I appreciate you sharing so much of that, especially I know that's so personal for you as well.
Yeah, well, I love that you give me the platform to do it, and you make me feel safe enough to do it, right? Like it's these moments on here that are exciting, because again, I want to have children of first responders get on the show, call in. Oh my gosh, I remember that. Don't I
Hmm.
please, there are definitely probably more adults, but even teens, right? Like tell us, because there's probably a few that are going through the same thing right now of seeing their parent come home and maybe feel defeated by their job and hear about the department stuff and feel a certain way. And how I think we both want them to come on here and share that stuff too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, that whole thing of like, you're not alone in dealing with this, and that, your parent maybe has a frustration with the job, but that's not who they are, or different things like that.
Now, it's definitely on that parent, though, to make sure they separate it from their family, because again, I do think that could come home and that could be an impact.
Well, of course. And I think that's such a parenting is hard. And that's the end of the podcast, because parenting is hard.
That's the start and the finish.
However, I think, this story that you're sharing is such a perfect way to like navigate something like that. Again, you're of age to have this kind of conversation with. I'm hearing you say that it was impactful. It hurt me to see my dad hurt, because that's what happens in loving relationships. If one of us gets hurt, we're all getting hurt. Yeah. But, it wasn't, well, I don't want to upset Ashlee, so I'm not going to tell her what's upsetting me. And honestly, what gets to happen throughout that experience is, a lesson that you get to learn, seeing your dad endure something like that, gosh, what a value lesson in terms of, honoring your value system and things. So I don't know, I have to navigate sometimes as a parent, and then obviously working with parents of like, as a parent, you always want to make your child's life easy. As a parent, you always want to cuddle and love and, nothing bad in this world. But in fact, what it is about is, again, having these honest, age appropriate, honest conversations that it says like, this life is hard, but this is how we navigate those things. Okay, I just went on a whole.
No, I loved it.
Soapbox.
I feel like you wrapped us up like perfectly. I loved it very much so. And
parenting is hard.
Yeah. Well, and that's what we wanted to do with this episode, right? Is that we both know what we have coming down for everybody, and in these next, several episodes coming up, we have a lot that's going to be happening. And I just think we had to, like I said earlier, open this door to this topic of organizational dysfunction and talk about it through the lens of children, of what that can look like and how we see it, sharing this story. But I think you honestly wrap that up nicely, and it's helpful, I think, to have you share that side of things of parenting and what that can look like. So I appreciated that big time.
Well, thank you guys for listening. And as we've mentioned, please let us know what you want to hear, thoughts, all that good stuff.
Yeah, I definitely am really eager. I hope somebody reaches out about this topic too and wants to share a little bit of their story, whether it be a first responder or a child of a first responder. I think we are interested in that, but we're just so thankful. We're thankful to have you guys. And don't forget that when the call hits home, Jennifer and I are here for you. All right. We'll see you guys next episode. Bye.